to it.
No, of course. You're obviously very popular in the community. So that should be live. We should be live now,
Okay.
hopefully. I'm just waiting for it to come up on my screen because we have a live chat so people can talk to us.
Yeah.
And obviously ask you 1,000 questions.
Yeah.
So before we listen to what the public has to say, Ray, you've got such an interesting life. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history to where you are today?
Well, like anybody who tries to be honest, it's kind of all chance. I'll preface that briefly by saying that on a radio program, something like Desert Island Discs, it might have been Desert Island Discs, a philanthropic man who made a lot of money coming from a very poor background, at the end of the program was asked, there'll be a lot of early career people listening to this, and if you could sum up in one sentence from your experience, what's the most important thing for other people to bear in mind if they want to be lucky to have a career like he had in business? And he said something really wonderful, and I wrote it down. He said, you have to be willing to be lucky. And that really sums up me in the sense that for a great variety of what might seem weird reasons, like, tell me if I talk too much, all right?
I'm just fascinated about where your luck comes in.
So nobody from my family ever got A-levels, let alone went to university. And because I was born and raised in London, I didn't want to go anywhere cold and wet. I didn't know anything about universities. So I drew a line between London and Bristol and said, I'm not going anywhere further north than that. And I put them in order of how far south they were. And at that time, to do psychology, Exeter was the most southerly one. So I didn't know anything about it. I thought, oh, that's near the beach, I'll go there. I didn't know at all that it had one of the best psychology departments in the country. And the reason I did psychology was my girlfriend, when I was in sixth form, I happened to be very good at mathematics at school, and I always came top without doing any work whatsoever. So I don't deserve any credit for that. Never did. And one day,
take some credit for that, for definite.
One day, she said, you know, you want to go to university to do mathematics? And I said, yes. She said, I don't want you to do that. I said, don't you want me to go to uni? She said, I want you to go to uni, but I don't want you to do mathematics. And I said, why? She said, when you tell me about it, it'll be really boring. Can't you choose something interesting? So I looked up what I could do with my maths and physics A-levels and did psychology. So I went to this psych department that happened to be really good. Spent 6 years there. Then wanted to go back to London. Applied to a very traditional, prestigious place, which offered me a job, and to a new place, which offered me the job I didn't apply for. So being offered the job I didn't apply for, which was more interesting than the job I did apply for, I went there and had a great time there for 13 years. And then people said, well, it's about time you became yourself a full professor, head of department. And at that time, I do love London. I don't live there now, but I go there a lot. I used to. Are you based in London?
Yep, that's right. I'm based in the place where no one's allowed to come visit.
Yeah, on another occasion, we might talk about London together. Anyway, so I thought, I quite fancy venturing north, which I'd never done in my life. So I thought, quite interesting going to Scotland. So I went to work in Glasgow for 3 years, but the person I was married to hated the weather. So when I was invited to apply for a job on the south coast in Portsmouth, of course, good weather, etc. And I was lucky enough to get that job. And then I went there and I was very happy there, built up the department, a lot of good colleagues. Then I was invited to talk with the head of a university in the Midlands, a place called Leicester, and he offered me a great salary and lots of conditions, and said I didn't have to move because my kids were in school on the south coast. So I went there, and then when I reached the age of 65, I didn't want to work full time anymore because I spent all my time on committees, even the ones I chaired. Or the chairperson of were really boring. And because when you're chairperson, you can't cheat on your laptop, and everybody else can be, looking at the Maldives or planning their trip to Australia. But if you're the chairperson, you can't risk doing that. So that's why it's so boring being the chairperson.
Have to pay attention. How awful.
And then when I thought about stopping being an employee and setting up my own consultancy, a very experienced investigator did his PhD with me. He got a job at a nearby university to start up a new MSc course and supervise PhD students. But having been a senior government investigator, he'd never done either of those before. So he said to me one day, would I help him? And I said, yeah, we've become friends over the 5 years you've been doing a PhD part-time. He said, no, not as friends. I said, oh, what do you mean? He said, I've asked the university where I'm going to start work if they'll pay you to help me. I went, oh, all right then. So I still work at that university part-time, Derby, an evolving university. And I work there now, 7 years.
Are you still based down south then?
Yeah, I still live in Chichester.
Very nice.
So I've lived here since 96, yeah. Well, it is nice at the moment because I actually have a garden.
Hey,
yeah.
That's a luxury in these weird times, isn't it, really? You never thought it would be before.
Before I thought, oh, it's quite big, the garden front and back, and I think, oh, it's going to take me 5 hours to mow the lawn. But now I think, oh. So because so much was derelict in the garden before the lockdown, I'm still, after all these lockdown weeks, still got jobs I've got to do.
Oh gosh, well, don't get them finished too soon. Probably still got some time left.
Well, I don't know if you heard it on the radio. There was this guy talking the other day, now that France has opened, he said he's going to cycle to France. And I thought, oh, I'll come with you.
Oh my gosh, bonkers. I think probably, yeah, don't do that. It's dangerous. There's a lot of cars out on the roads, so be careful if you do.
So, I know this is more about me than you. Do we have any listeners? Because if we don't, you can tell me about you.
We do. We have 5 people watching at the moment.
Hello.
But there's going to be more coming, I'm sure. I do already have some questions that people have given me in advance.
Oh, okay.
We don't need to talk about me. So
another time.
Another time. So one of the things that you deal with, obviously, is false confessions. You've spoken about them quite often. And someone mentioned the case of Jens Soring in the 80s.
Yes.
Where he was making confessions and he got an expert in to say that it was false confession. But why, I mean, the question really was, why do people firstly even make these false confessions in the first place? Obviously, Jens Soring he did kill the parents, but what is behind that wanting to make that false confession?
Yeah, I mean, way back in the 60s, 70s and 80s, within the UK, there were some false confessions. And luckily enough, we live in a democracy with a free press. And though they don't occur very often, they're something that's very important to the media and society. So you hear and read about them when they do happen. I mean, since a big development occurred in police interviewing in England from 1992, the media have not reported since 92 a false confession that was caused by inappropriate police behavior, what we call a police coerced confession, though they do occur in many other countries still, and we're working to try to get that sorted out. So apart from a confession that's induced by coercion from the interrogators, then, as listeners will already know, a small people have falsely confessed because they want to be famous. You know, you might loosely describe these people as having some kind of what the law still calls mental illness. But they're rare, but they do happen. And of course, when a person comes into the police station to confess, the police have to treat that in a way in which they try to find out whether it's a valid confession by asking the person about the crime. The police will know things that the media don't know, so only the true culprit will know it unless they were under drugs or something. So you get these purposive false confessions for notoriety. There have been studies on why people falsely confess, particularly by Professor Gisliger Johnson. And what those studies show, particularly with young adults, is when people falsely confess, they often do it to protect somebody else. A buddy, a friend. If we get out of adolescence into more senior organized crime, then a member of a group, whether it's organized crime or terrorism, will falsely confess to protect a senior person. And if the false confession leads to imprisonment, the family of the person who falsely confessed is looked after by the organization. When the person eventually comes out, they have a large amount of money in their bank account. Again, it's not very frequent. That's the more difficult to detect, because the person who did it will tell the false confessor some information that makes the false confessor seem truthful. Luckily, they don't happen very often.
And when we're talking about, because I've definitely seen an episode of Law and Order where they've gone into that specific gang situation. Yeah. When we're talking about the true or false confessions, we've got a question here from Kiri, and she says, when it comes to criminals in specific, do the police focus more on answers or bodily expressions, such as microexpression and eye positioning?
Definitely on answers. There's a lot of research which shows, so the belief that when people are being untruthful, for most people that's stressful, and stress influences their behavior. Part of that is a kind of valid assumption that most ordinary people, when they're stressed, their behavior changes. But of course, we take a scenario like, imagine the two people have been living together for a long while. If I may, let's just, for the purpose of illustration, call them husband and wife. You'll see why in a minute. The wife is brutally murdered in her own home. The husband did not murder her and knew nothing about it. He is totally innocent, but of course the police don't know that. He knows the statistics that when a person who's in a meaningful, deep relationship with somebody else who they're living together is murdered in their own home, it's more than 60% likely that the person who did it is the other person, the husband. So the innocent husband knows he's the prime suspect. He has just lost the person he loved in all the world for the last 25 years. So he's in a terrible emotional state. And when he's asked any questions to do with the murder, he's going to react enormously. Not because he did it, but the reasons I explained. It's very complicated because the most serious kind of criminals, and perhaps the most serious, are psychopaths. They don't have the anxiety about what they did. They don't have guilt. So they don't react in that way. Microexpressions occur very, very rarely when people are lying. And even when they do occur, most observers can't see them. So that's not much use either. It's much better to concentrate, as the questioner said, on what the person says, in particular, the content of what they say. And in some situations, when the person who is being deceptive, let's assume they're the criminal, is asked a valid question they did not anticipate, it takes them a while to think of the answer. So it isn't that pausing before answering is always a sign, because the husband could be upset and he might pause and gather himself and then answer. But my good friend and colleague, Professor Order at Bright Portsmouth, he and his team have looked into asking things like unanticipated questions, and it does appear to have some validity. The dilemma, of course, is being sure what is an unanticipated question, because you don't know how well the guilty person has prepared for the interview. And if they're smart, they will have anticipated almost all of the questions you think are unanticipated.
Do you think that psychopaths are smart when you take in that point of view?
Yeah, we're writing a paper on it at the moment, and a colleague of mine, she's the expert on psychopaths, and I understand from her and reading the literature, yes, a lot of psychopaths are very intelligent.
And then obviously that's going to give a different level, because you're saying there about people preparing themselves.
Yes.
And obviously someone who's maybe a psychopath is going to be thinking already well advanced of
Yes.
the basic questions. And what about sociopaths? Because obviously people do think that in day to day there's more sociopaths around us than psychopaths. Do you think they're as intelligent? It's a
Not
generic question.
Yeah, my understanding of this literature is I'm not an expert, but I think sociopaths are more, without going into too much psychological or statistical jargon, equally distributed throughout the population. And therefore, there are some who are very intelligent, some like me are average, and some like some other friends of mine are not very clever. So certainly, well, I'll say one more thing and then we'll have another question. When I go around the world sharing what we've developed in forensic psychology that's relevant, and I'm speaking to experienced investigators, the one thing that they always go, oh my God, I've never thought of that, is when I say to them, how often, when interviewing a suspect, have you interviewed a suspect who is much cleverer than you are? And they'll go, oh, never thought of that. And then I say to them, sorry, one more sentence. The literature on serial murders and serial rapists, they're serial because they've got away with doing it 4 or 5 times before they're caught. So they are smart by success. But there was some studies years ago in the States of the intelligence level of people now in prison for committing serious crimes quite often and then eventually got caught. And their intelligence level is almost off the scale. They are so clever.
Got it. Well, I bet they're in special wards though, aren't they? If they when they get caught.
Yeah.
So Andy has a question. So do police VIT teams currently benefit from forensic psychology input as a matter of routine to inform understanding of the behavior of victims and perpetrators? I guess that's asking if there's specific people.
Yeah, so obviously I know best the UK and particularly England and Wales, so I'll take it in that context. I'm not an expert on what happens in other countries with regard to that, but certainly in the UK for quite a few years now, there's been an organized system. So any police organization in the UK has interviewers of different levels of experience, and because their interviews are recorded, you can tell whether they're any good or not. So they only get promoted if they're actually good themselves. And the top level, so in any large police force, I'm from London, you're based in London, so let's say the London Metropolitan Police, they will have a handful of officers who are very knowledgeable about interviewing and psychology and the law and anything else you can think of. And those men and women are called interview advisors, and they spend their whole time advising other experienced interviewers how to interview in particular cases. So we now have 2, 3, 4 officers in every big police force who have that knowledge. Some of them had to retire under the cuts in the police some years ago, so we don't have as many as did. But what we still have is the National Police College, whatever it's called now, Serious Crime Agency perhaps. They have a list of about 18 outside the police experts, behavioral science advisors. And to be on that list, you have to have achieved a number of things, worked on a number of cases, got references from the people you worked on those cases, could be police, could be lawyers. And in relatively rare cases where the interviewer advisors don't have the relevant knowledge, they can call up one of these advisors depending on the advisor's expertise. So I'm one of those advisors. So I know nothing about the criminal mind. As I said, I'm not an expert on psychopaths, so I'm not phoned up about that. They would consult me in difficult cases about interviewing, For example, how do you best interview a 2-year-old? I had calls about that in, you know, in certain cases. So in this country, obviously I'm biased and I'm personally involved, but we certainly cater for the interview being as best informed by research and knowledge more than any other country I'm aware of. Other countries are catching up. I'm honoured to say they're copying what hundreds of people have done within the UK.
That's good to know, especially if, you know, they're using us as a basis. So one of the questions, so this is probably from back in the 80s, really.
Yeah.
That obviously criminal investigation now is quite formal, and we have to do things a certain way when we go to a scene so that it can go all the way to court.
Yeah.
But back in the day, when we
Yeah.
didn't know things like DNA was going to be as well understood, or we could get prints of certain things, or you know, blood from certain things, what was the idea behind actually like collecting all this evidence when we didn't know what the future was going to hold?
Well, I think it was a very clever idea. I think one of the things that was realized by the police service in this country, certainly by the 80s, if not a bit earlier, of course, before, as you're helpfully saying, before DNA, for example, of course, they knew about blood testing. Obviously, decades ago, you needed a bucket full of blood to tell the blood group. You know, now you need just a speck. But luckily enough, they did realize, and certainly though police in the USA used to get criticism, a lot of the Innocence Project in the USA is when the police and or the prosecution kept forensic samples like blood or hair at the time when they knew the sample was too small to be tested, in the hope that something would come in the future. So, as you say, that was very foresightful that they would do that. But of course, when you go, I don't know the history of this really well, but when you go back to the 30s, the idea of forensic science, like in the 30s, footprints were collected, you know, the shoes, not necessarily bare feet, sometimes bare feet. And there are other examples, and there was a very famous French person whose name I've forgotten, who kind of kicked off the whole of forensic science in terms of crime investigation. I think, and I have this vague undergraduate memory in my head, that was something like the year 1913, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so there is a long history of collecting things for which they may not necessarily right now be a test.
And that, I think that's, I wonder what we're doing now that we haven't got the tests for, that we're collecting.
Yeah, I wonder too. I don't know, because it seems everything you could possibly that might identify me, they do collect. There was a debate some years ago about ear prints. You know, if you know, somebody had listened against the window before breaking in, and there was a robbery, and then there was a fight and a person died. I don't know whether ear prints are successfully discriminate between people. They probably don't, because we would have heard about them. But I knew there were some studies like 15 years ago. So whether something out of that will come.
It's about collecting them, isn't it? Because obviously you got that one print at the scene, but if people aren't collecting ear prints from then until now, it's kind of a bit.
Yeah, and you know, some people that need to be investigated because they've committed crime, not necessarily a serious crime. You know, the more serious crime, on average, the cleverer the person that did it. So minor crime, on average, is not done by really clever people. So you could imagine a situation, it's not allowed in England to lie to suspects, but in another country where they are allowed to lie, like the USA, they could say, we've got your ear print, that would be a truthful statement, and we can match it to you. That would be the untruthful part. So a person who didn't know much might believe that.
I do think that as my favorite thing for bedroom forensic bingo is CSI, always using that as a.
Yes, yeah.
They can definitely match ear prints, everything though.
Oh yeah, yeah. Of course, and a lot of the American shows that I used to watch until they became formulaic. For example, the early series of CSI, because it was interesting and mostly at that time based on reality, but they had to invent new things. And then I used to watch NCIS, but that again got very formulaic. So I'm not so keen on them anymore. I like the American version of Sherlock, if you ever watched that. That's really interesting.
Oh, Elementary.
Yes.
Yes. I think it's
Crazy,
cancelled now, but it was good.
It was good. And one of the programs that I used to like to watch many years ago, so some of our listeners may not know of it, it made in the UK, was called Waking the Dead.
Oh, yeah.
And in that, the main investigator, detective chief superintendent looking into cold cases of murder, famous actor called Trevor Eve. But part of the team was a lady who was a psychologist. And the company that made Waking the Dead actually asked psychologists to advise them about what the psychologists could do, how they would behave. I wasn't involved. A friend of mine was one of the advisors. And I think because of that, again, I'm biased because it was a friend advising. But what they did in that program was pretty realistic and well informed. And then a person who did a PhD with me many years ago, we still work together, Professor Becky Milne, she used to advise the producers of the program, The Bill, whenever they wanted to do an interview. They'd phone Becky up and say, you know, can we make sure we've got the script right? Is this realistic? Would this happen?
Do you think though that in a way it's great that it's obviously realistic from your point of view and mine to look at it, but
Yes.
do you think maybe we sometimes give away things to people who potentially looking to commit crimes?
Obviously, for somebody, I hate to use these words, somebody who's a bit stupid, a bit dumbo, they may not know about, going back to DNA, about fingerprints or so and so, but it will be very difficult to find anybody above 8 years old in England who didn't know about fingerprints, who didn't know about blood, who didn't know about hair. So all didn't know about CCTV. So all the forensic stuff, given that we don't think there's any secret forensic stuff, that's kind of well known to almost anybody. Now, whether we take your good advice and go back some decades and say, you know, without it being in the media, would people have guessed about it? Difficult to know, but you know, if I committed a crime 30 years ago and I cut myself and blood went on the floor, even if I didn't know about testing of blood, it would have worried me because it's part of me left. When it comes to kind of methods of interviewing that are not kind of forensic science stuff, then some people say, by publishing the work that I and others around the world are doing on this, is it going to give the game away? But what we've found out is the most effective things are the most humane and honest things. So things that look like trickery, that some members of the public and investigators in other countries might be worried about giving away, they don't actually work. So it seems a kind of crazy answer, but I think there's a lot of research now showing that for the vast majority of people who commit crime, including horrible terrorism crime and organized crime, that because they happen to be a human being, even though they have enormous problems and faults, they're more likely to tell you a valid account if you treat them, I can't use the word respect because that's, you can't respect a child abuser, but if you don't treat them badly, they're more likely to tell you. I mean, when we started writing about that 20 years ago, I was very concerned that it might only apply to societies like the UK, where luckily almost everybody, even those who commit crime, has a lot of humanity. And I worried whether it might apply to terrorists and to war criminals. But it seems to, I'm now quoting the research of other people, not myself. So I don't think there's anything to worry about making public how investigators are trained. You've frozen. We got
Sorry about
something
that.
happened, didn't it?
That was my computer decided that it didn't want to get on my Wi-Fi and it disappeared. But we're back now. Sorry about that. So I think from the last we were talking about was you saying about how it's different from the UK.
Yes.
And someone has put, Atishi has put, I liked your book, A Beginner's Guide to Criminal Psych.
Oh, thanks.
And obviously you've got book as all that's still obviously out on Amazon. You can go get it if you want to, on criminal investigation. So this is Andy again who's asked another question.
Yeah.
Can forensic psychology be used by police to join the dots of seemingly unconnected abusive behavior?
I sound like a professor now because I'm not quite sure the nature of the question. So when we're asked unconnected, is that with different victims or is it with the same victim at different times?
I'm going to go from here. So because it's the examples of control of coercive behavior and pathological narcissism, I'm assuming that it's going to be the same victim and same perpetrator.
Oh, so the police might, or society might want the police to build up a picture from these bits of information that may or may not be connectable. Is that more like what we're being asked, do you think?
I think so. Or potentially, if say, this is just me thinking out loud, say if there was domestic violence in one household and it was the perpetrator, and then say someone got killed in a different county, because the domestic same victim is the answer.
Okay. Yes, I mean,
thank you, Andy.
I mean, as every period of 5 or 10 years goes by, society's priorities change, and if you're lucky enough, the police follow society's priorities. I think we're reasonably lucky in this country, with sometimes too long a delay that happens. So at this very moment, of course, when we know from the media that people reporting being victim of domestic violence, has gone up by at least 50%. And the police are now treating this as a high priority, perhaps because in their view, other issues that they normally deal with, let's go back, say, to terrorism, are probably not happening as much, at the moment. And I think that the problem sometimes the police have is because we have quite rightly, in my opinion, an independent prosecution service. So the police investigate and they pass the file to the prosecution. And the prosecution, have rules like, is it in the public interest? And is it more likely than less likely there'll be a conviction? So the prosecution, in their judgment, have to weigh up the strength of the evidence in order to decide whether to move forward, having received a file from the police. Now, the dilemma with domestic violence for the prosecution is they say, and they have figures I don't know, that before it gets to court, a lot of victims of domestic violence withdraw their evidence. Now, that could be because they're further threatened with violence. But because domestic violence goes on behind closed doors, and often there's no witnesses. I think now wasn't it a few months ago that the police can now prosecute the perpetrator of domestic violence, given that there's injuries to the victim's body, even if the victim doesn't want the case to go forward? I think there's been a change in procedures.
I'll take your word for that.
And there used to be a similar problem with rape. In this, most people know that most rapes are committed by an acquaintance, not a stranger. Like 80% or more are acquaintance, less than 20% are stranger. And a bit like domestic violence, acquaintance rape doesn't happen in the park. It happens at one or more persons' homes. And again, because the people were or are still in some kind of relationship, the victim, and of course men can be the victims of inappropriate sexual behavior, they sometimes don't want to come forward. In the old days, of course, going back to your good point about what happened decades ago, the police were under the false impression that most people making a rape allegation were not giving a valid account. That's a correct, sorry, that is clearly a grossly incorrect view. That there's lots of research that shows the vast majority of people who make a rape allegation are giving a valid account. And the police have really changed the way, and the prosecution have changed the way. So the police will investigate, but the prosecution, if they don't think the evidence is enough to convict, they won't go forward.
I mean, I've got not that it's not even near that kind of type of case, but back in my day when I was, CSIing out and about, many a time CPS didn't take my case forward, even though I had fingerprint evidence or blood evidence, because they just didn't see the cost and effect of taking it to court. So it's frustrating on both sides, but we'll not get into that, the CPS, but we'll talk about personality disorders a little bit, because one of the questions from Astishi, which Kiri then also asks as well, is how do you interview people with multiple personality disorders like schizophrenia or potentially pathological narcissism? How do you go about, I mean, obviously they're very different, but
what you do, I'll go back to very briefly what I said earlier, is if you're in that situation, the person doing the interview will already be very experienced. They won't let an inexperienced interviewer interview in that kind of case. They will consult with the interview advisor in their police force in these circumstances, and quite often they will phone as about 3 or 4 of the what I call behavioral science advisors, who are not police officers, who are expert in terms of issues to do with personality. I'm not one of them, but they will call in and get advice from one of those people about how you interview, how can we put it, very peculiar, unusual kind of persons. And there are stories around, I don't know if any of them are valid because it's all not published, as to what guidance they're sometimes given. But I know of one case where experienced police officers were getting nowhere interviewing a very mature man who might have killed dozens of people. And they spoke to the external advisor, who is an expert on personality disorder, etc., etc. And he advised them that since he felt from the file he was given that the suspect was very narcissistic, that if they then got somebody to conduct a new interviewer who looked younger than he or she really was, who was good at interviewing, they knew, but could pretend to be incompetent, to go in and fall over and drop all the papers on the floor, which she did, and to say, oh, I don't know why I've come to talk to you. I was on traffic patrol last week. Well, she can't lie, so whatever she said about indicating that she's completely inexperienced, that the experienced interviewers have got other bit more important cases to deal with than you. We can't let you go because of all this evidence suggesting that you committed these murders. And he started talking to her, and in the end he confessed. Now that's
It's
just anecdote. There's nothing
yeah.
in writing, but I believe there's some validity to that story I've just given you.
I feel that that's quite, you can see those kind of personalities in your day-to-day life as well. Obviously not everyone's going to be a narcissist and a killer or an abuser.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just adapting, I guess. But you mentioned earlier as well that, you know, some of the things that you get phoned up for is to their interview techniques. Are you allowed to tell us about the 2-year-old that you mentioned?
Well, certainly a famous case some decades ago where a mother was out in a public area in a park at a time when it was not at all busy. And she was found murdered. I forget how she was killed. Let's say she was stabbed. And on top of her body was her 2-year-old. And it's therefore very likely that the 2-year-old saw what happened. So the police called me because I used to work on interviewing children. And I said, well, in the guidance that I and a lawyer wrote for the government, you need to follow that exactly. You know, there's no point in asking a child, describe in your own words what happened. There's no point saying that to a 2-year-old. So you have to kind of basically get the child to communicate to other questions that are kind of yes/no questions that have got nothing to do with the investigation. And then when you feel that the child understands when to nod or when to shake your head, I can't remember the details. And they also said that they, because of reasons they couldn't tell me, they had a person they kind of slightly suspected who may have done it, who lived nearby, etc., didn't have an alibi. And they had a photograph of this suspect. And they said, how do we show a set of photographs, including the suspect, to a 2-year-old, bearing in mind we have to instruct the witness that the person that we've asked them to look for may or may not be there. You know, a 2-year-old won't how do we do it with a 2-year-old? So I just answered as best I could. I don't think my answer was particularly informative because there wasn't much research with 2-year-olds. Another case, it was a 4-year-old who were playing in her front garden a couple of years ago, and there was no fence or gate. She could easily walk from the garden to the pavement, and a car drew up. The witnesses saw this, and the passenger door opened, and the little got in it and was driven off. And you know, most of the local people think that must be a uncle. They didn't recognize the car. They knew it wasn't the car of the family, but because the child went voluntarily, they didn't really think much of it. But when the parents, like 5 minutes later, looked out of the window and said, where's our daughter? They ran out, and the neighbor said, oh, she just got in a car of a friend of yours. And they, what? Luckily, some 3 or 4 hours later, somewhere else in the same town, the little girl was found unharmed, lost. And of course, the police had no idea what had happened to the girl. And of course, they felt there was some possibility that a crime had been committed. But you don't want to plant the idea of a crime in the mind of a 4-year-old. So they asked me about that. So that's the kind of thing I sometimes work on.
That sounds horrific. Having to deal with the children's memories. I mean, memory is such a fluid thing, like to try and remember certain aspects, and having a child still developing their theory of mind must be quite difficult.
Well, it is and it isn't. A lot of the mistakes that people who are not purposely lying. So imagine you're interviewing a child and there's reason to believe the child is trying to memorize correctly. a lot of the things that we adults suffer from, bias, confabulation, what in psychology is called schema and scripts, young children don't have. They're much more literal. So one reason why loads of research, not necessarily on real crime, but on mock crime or watching the video of a crime within ethical bounds of children, find the proportion of what children say that is accurate, is correct, is the same as adults. They say less. And so if a child provides information that's kind of a useful nature from their memory, it's as likely to be valid as a university professor.
So does that mean that you can't indoctrinate a child then?
Well, can you hear me?
Yep.
Because I've got a sign saying you can't hear me.
Oh, I can hear you.
Yeah, we've done research on that. Again, Professor Ray led the research we did about training children. In most cases and there are some cases where a child is encouraged by somebody to give a false account or an account that's partly false. If the child is quite young, like primary school or younger, you have to be very clever to train them to speak like a child. You know, because what a naive adult would do would tell the child to say something that's more adult-like. But if you train children to provide childlike information, unless you know what the childlike information is, this is quite difficult to achieve, then the child giving a partly false account, it's more difficult to detect. But only if they've been trained what we might call appropriately, which doesn't happen that often. Yeah, so there are lots of wonderful things that children say, and when they say it, a procedure developed in Germany that looks at the content of what children say, emphasizes this. And I've had it in cases that I've worked on. I remember one 4-year-old who's giving an account of, how can I put this in the media, the private part of a man being large.
Very well put.
Right? She describes it as his stick bottom.
Okay.
I can't hear you anymore.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Oh, this is hopefully you can hear me now. No, honestly, this Zoom today is not playing up. I don't know if it's, oh, I really wanted to hear about the stick bottom story.
Now I can hear you.
Oh, very odd.
Yeah, I don't know
It's
what.
probably my internet. I don't know why. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Tell me about the stick bottom. I'm on the edge of my seat.
Well, as soon as she said that, I mean, obviously I'm looking at the video recorded interview. You think, you know, adults can imagine what she means by stick bottom, and contextually it was highly relevant. And going back to your point about can you train children to effectively lie, you've got to be really, really smart adult to train a child to say that. So that's one example.
And then obviously with that particular example, though, they got you in at to find out how children can speak, and you've got quite a few research on children speaking and children's body language.
Yes.
So, I mean, at what point do they usually get you in? Straight away, so that you can?
No. What would so on rare occasions, it might be before they conduct the interview. Most of the work I do is when the interview is being conducted, and as we know, they're almost always video recorded, even with vulnerable adults. And the police might want feedback. I can talk about a big case in a minute if you have time. on how they're doing, or the prosecution might want an independent view as to how well the interview is done in order to decide to go forward with it, or the prosecution might go forward with it, and then the defense have access to it, and then the defense might want an independent opinion as to what extent the interview followed the appropriate training and guidance. In the last 10 years, the answer is almost always yes, the interview is good.
I think that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Because they always say try and get the eyewitnesses, especially with children, they just get them out of court, because you can never trust a child. But if you know what you're looking for, then obviously, you know.
Yeah, well, they're definitely, until the late 1980s, used to be a prevailing view, and there are some famous quotes from leading lawyers about not relying on the evidence of children. But then there used to be a BBC TV program on Sunday evenings, chaired by a lady called Esther Ransom, who without warning had a whole program about the alleged sexual abuse of teenagers at a particular residential school. And then along the same time, a law professor from Cambridge, John Spencer, was arguing that there was no actual valid reason to disbelieve the evidence of children if they were questioned appropriately. And then the government appointed a committee chaired by a senior judge in the late 1980s, and it's known by his name, Judge Pigott, the Pigott Report. And the Home Office commissioned an independent review, not by me, of the evidence that would underpin the belief that children should or should not be believed. And the review done by that person was regarded as an excellent review, and she came to the conclusion there was no valid reason, in the absence of evidence to the contrary. Like if you knew the child had been trained, let's say in a messy divorce case, that would cause you to have some concern. But in the absence of reasons to disbelieve the child, there was no strong reason to disbelieve children more than you disbelieve adults, because a lot of adults perfectly lie. A lot of adults don't lie but make mistakes.
Absolutely. I think there was a few cases in America where they believed a child but didn't then go and find extra evidence. So I know there's one case, I can't remember the name of who got put away, but she said it was her uncle who killed her grandparents, and they just took the kid's word for it without any extra evidence. So ultimately, it's not the child that's to blame there. It's not following the processes of continuing doing my forensic criminal investigation.
Yeah.
It's just crazy sometimes that people make an excuse or whatever for their own letdown, really. But have you got, so what is the case that you were going to tell me? We have time to listen.
Okay, so this was many years ago, but it was around the time, it relates to what we just talked about, when we were talking about people wondering whether you could rely on the evidence from a child if that's gathered appropriately. There was also concern, and perhaps there still is some concern, about the same question with what people in English law are still labeled as having mental handicap. I don't like that wording, but that's the legal thing. And there was growing evidence, which is now reasonably well accepted, that in places where vulnerable adults go because they need protection, they're so vulnerable, they can't live with their family or they can't live by themselves. They have to go to a special residence, which might loosely be called a home. Like we're now talking about the virus and care homes. So these are like care homes for people of various ages who, what I'm talking about, who can't care for themselves. And so in the early days, when people residential in that care home who have, of course, by definition, limited communicative competence, would somehow indicate or try to indicate that something was going wrong in their residence, maybe when they had a visitor. A case I dealt with in the late 1980s in Scotland, where the lady in her early 20s was in a residence during the week, but her parents could cope with looking after her just at weekends, but she needed so much looking after, they couldn't do it 7 days a week. So at the weekend, she kind of communicated, or I can't remember how, that she might have been abused. But this case we worked on, so a major police source phoned up myself and my colleague Professor Becky Mill when I worked at Portsmouth and said, we have good reason to believe from a whistleblower who worked at the care home, who never saw abuse, but from various signs and signals that she shared with us, felt abuse was being conducted by the owner, the two owners, man and wife, owned the care home. So they said, we believe this whistleblower. You know, it's not certain that abuse occurs, but we believe what this whistleblower has told us. So we are going to investigate. And what we're going to do is we're going to get a psychologist who knows about mental handicap to look at the files and then meet the 20 or so residents of this home and see which, if any of them, if interviewed appropriately, might be able to give information. So we're going to put them into groups, like might be able to speak, possibly can communicate, no chance of getting any information from them. So Professor Gisliger Johnson did that with the police. And there were some people that he felt with highly skilled police questioning might be able to give an account. So the police organization, who had been trained in interviewing vulnerable people, said that they were going to do their first interview with the resident that Professor Good Johnson said was most likely to be able to communicate. And then they wanted to, with a police motorcyclist, the 150 miles, come with that video recording the very exact day to the university. And they wanted Professor Milne and I to look at that interview, to write a report, to fax that back. So the next day, when they interviewed resident number 2, they had learned from how they interviewed resident number 1. And we did that for several days. And I have to say, the interviewers already were really good. But by the end of this whole procedure, they were just amazing. But the prosecution was still worried about whether it met their criteria for likely to be a successful prosecution, because it was one of the very first to bring proceedings against people in charge of care homes. You know, the abuse in religious communities around the world had not yet come to criminal proceedings. You know, it's a long way ago. And then somebody within the police or the prosecution found out that there was a law that if you run a care home, you can be found guilty of serious wrongdoing and go to jail on the balance of probability, not beyond reasonable doubt. That's the normal criterion, you know, the 95% criterion that the prosecution have to think of when deciding to go forward. So they proceeded with this prosecution. And another sad thing happened. The day before the case began, the accused man, the owner, committed suicide. His wife was found guilty and went to jail. And I think that case, because of the open-mindedness of the police and the prosecution, led the way for other similar cases in more recent years.
Right, that's just, it's one of those things that says it all, doesn't it? If someone's going to commit suicide before they can get prosecuted, you know that you're doing something wrong in the first place. And it's such a sad story. It's because a lot of those residential homes, you know, luckily, I mean, there's only been one recent case in Oxford, year before last, I think. But most of the time we have tried to make sure that they are better cared for.
Yeah.
I mean, do you find that you personally have been affected by any of the work that you've seen and been involved with?
A bit like that case, yes, but when you add the negatives and the positives, it kind of sometimes comes out a bit more positive. Yeah, so I'm trying to keep calm now. So I've watched recorded interviews where the person, adult or more often children, is giving an account that's made me cry, and I have to stop watching it. I don't know the outcome of most of the cases that I've been involved in, but I do know the outcome of some, like the case I just shared with you. I remember another case where the man was accused of sexually abusing some children, and during his trial, he was not in prison at that time. He committed suicide. Other cases, I remember one case I testified, a criminal case in, no, it was a civil case in Belfast. It was a rare occasion where the interviewing had more weaknesses and strengths. And some of what the child said, the court came to the view, might have been unduly influenced by the interviewer. The interviewer was not that skilled. And so, you know, I produced a written report, and most of the times that's accepted by everybody at the court. But sometimes you're called to give evidence and be cross-examined because the other side doesn't necessarily agree with what you've said. So I'd said that compared to most other interviews I'd seen within the UK, this was less skilled. You know, some of it was satisfactory and some of it was not. It wasn't incompetent. It just wasn't very good. And it was poorest at the time. The child then said the most incriminating things. So it's a bit of a cause for concern. And of course, we still don't know the truth of the matter. But what caused me a mixed emotional reaction was I was invited by the judge to remain, and because it was a civil case, there was no jury. And the judge decided on the balance of probability there was insufficient evidence that the man had abused the child. And as I left the courtroom, the man came up and gave me a big hug, the accused man. You know, that was really difficult to deal with because on the one hand, he of course may have done something, but on the other hand, he may have been totally innocent. But these things don't happen too often. But yeah, and one of the things, sorry, just to add to that before we move on, one of the persons I'm helping doing her PhD, where we're looking at the effect of empathy when interviewing people suspected of sexual offences, empathy by the interviewer, which is very difficult to do. One of the things we talk about there is the kind of burnout you might get from working on these kind of cases. I mean, if you're like President Trump and believe in the effectiveness of torture for people you hate, then you're under the false belief that if you deliver torture, you don't have worries. But in America, Joshua Phillips has got a great book showing that a lot of Americans who were ordered to deliver torture years ago in armed conflict never got over it. So there's all sorts of emotions you can have. Yeah, and of course, at the moment, there aren't many cases going on, but when I work on cases, I try to work on only one at a time for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is the emotion it will probably cause me. Yeah.
I would say, just to go back to the when the man hugged you that you said, I mean, do you find sometimes that you have to put your moral compass to one side?
Yeah, quite often, because, you know, you not only want to be independent, but you sign an affidavit that you've done your best to be independent. And of course, if you're called upon to testify in court, you have to be, you know, you're there on behalf of the court, irrespective of who's called you, irrespective of what your scientific training suggests you might want to share with the court. You know, I never say whether this child is believable or not, because you don't know. You just say what is the information that might help the court decide. Yeah. you know, that's real life.
Yes, very true. I guess even if you're like your friend down the pub is telling you a story and you still have to make that decision whether you believe them or not.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There's a question from Astishi. We'll go for this one last, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of your day and enjoy the sunshine.
All right.
He's asked, have you ever experienced a case where the interviewer had to interview someone from his own family member or friends?
No, I don't think that would ever be allowed. Oh, yes.
Go on.
Normally, because I was thinking of interviewer like a social worker, a police officer, whatever. But there was a case where I was consulted where, let me get this right. It was some years ago now. Right. So the mother and the father were not living together, and there was bad feeling between them for they'd been not living together for quite a few years, but there was still bad feeling, and they lived in the same town. And the little girl, I don't know how old she was, I think she was like 5 or 6, mostly lived with the mother, but under the court arrangement, she went some weekends to stay with her father. And that seemed to go okay. And then when the child was with her mum, this part I might be making up, the mother was bathing the child or something and had reason to ask the child, oh, you look a bit sore. And by the mother's account, she didn't ask any leading questions. And by the mother's account, the little girl said something that might have implicated her father. But the mum didn't go any further at that time. Later, maybe later that day or the next day, she and her daughter were, as they were, sitting down chatting in the lounge. And what the mother had done without telling the daughter is she had set up a video recorder to video the conversation. And by the mother's account, they started talking and mum said something, I'm just going to the loo. When she went to the loo and she came back, she turned the recorder on. So the recording apparently was only of the conversation that followed on from what the little girl had said in the bath, i.e. what daddy may or may not have done that might be inappropriate. So the mum made this recording. So the mum's the interviewer. This is the point, right? But then, before passing the recording to the police, the mum edited out all the mum speaking. So all you had was the child answers.
That's a bit weird.
So this came to the notice of the police, who then, understandably, talked with the father. And he protested his innocence. Of course, they don't have enough on to arrest him at the moment. Then the little girl, because there's no order against it yet, is still going to visit him at weekends. She seems quite happy to do that. He records a conversation with her. He doesn't have a video camera. He does it on audio. And he edits out his questions. So I'm sent all this. And they say, we know the questions aren't there, which is, of course, very important to know that what the questions are. But is there anything in what the child says that's not appropriate for a child? Language, concepts, phraseology. You know, if she'd use some kind of complicated abstract sentence, like, you know, you think, that sounds like adult language. Maybe she'd been coached. So there was nothing in what she said on either recording that indicated that it wasn't childlike. I was able to say that, but that was all I was able to say. Anyway, it eventually went to court. I don't know the outcome.
It seems really odd, though. Why would you edit that?
People have interviewed their own family, but of course they weren't professionals.
I think obviously it's great if you can like film it. That was a great idea from the mother, but to edit it, you would already think that's suspicious. That she's saying something, maybe potentially put the idea in their head. So just a final one before you head off. Have you got any advice for people who want to follow your path? I mean, apart from being lucky.
I think when that guy, we said at the beginning when you and I are talking about, a guy said he his greatest source of his success was willing to be lucky. And I said that I felt that partly applied to me. So another way of putting that is to be kind of open-minded and don't dismiss anything just because it's not what you expect or what you know or what you thought of. Like if something happens that's kind of relevant to your life or career, and if you have the opportunity to think it over for some minutes or hours or maybe a day, and don't dismiss it immediately. I learned that partly by chance of one of my maths teachers at school. So I did applied maths, physics, and pure maths. And the teacher of pure maths was really boring for 2 years. He would come, write formula on the board, not say a word, we copied it, he would go out, here's your homework. But on one occasion, he's talking about probability theory, and he said, when you have more than one alternative, like you've got 2 or 3 things you could do, but you can't choose between them, when you thought about it, that's because they're equally useful, so anyone will do. So I kind of took that and developed it a bit further and say, yeah, don't dismiss things out of hand just because they're unusual or unexpected. Think, oh, I'll think about that. Yeah, that's the advice I would give.
It's your life advice as well, I think, not just for criminal investigations.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ray, for joining me today.
Well, thank you for the great questions from your colleagues and yourself. It was really interesting from my point of view.
Thanks for the internet. I mean, I could listen to you all day about your interesting investigations, but we have been on now, well, after the bits of breaks, because of my lovely internet, been on for over an hour.
Yeah.
So we'll let these people go. But thank you very much.
Okay.
And I'm just going to stop the stream now. So goodbye, everybody.